Hi, this is Anita from the Global Trade Gal. Today, I want to talk about the impact of global supply chain disruptions. And even though I'm talking specifically about the home decor business, which is my business, which is home decor and home furniture, because at Mondoro, we create, develop, and manufacture home decor and home furniture. This really applies to all types of businesses and industries. I believe that this is an extremely timely topic, especially now as the United States is putting tariffs on, just about everybody. But there's many ways that you could I guess you could call it sort of like the barrier to trade, like that this can hurt the global supply chain. And some of them aren't the barrier of trade, they're just things that sort of happen. And I've listed out here sort of like 15 of them we're going to talk about here. One of them is the trade wars. We're now looking at trade wars going on between the United States and Canada, the United States and Europe, the United States and China, the United States and basically everybody. The thing about a trade war is there's no winners. People think, well, we're going to win. This is going to bring back the jobs. I don't see any winners that's ever really happened from a trade war. Only thing most people end up getting is higher prices, and because they get higher prices, you got less sales, and it hurts the economy. Example of the U.S. China trade war on Chinese manufacturers. They resulted in higher retail prices in the U.S. market, and there's many people that are estimating now with this current trade war, it could be a couple $100 for U.S. families every single month because of these tariffs. That brings me to the number two, which is the tariffs, which is this costly barrier. Tariffs are essentially taxes that are imposed on imported goods. I was talking to a friend of mine recently about this, and she's like, well, doesn't the country pay? I said, no. Tariff is paid on the U.S. side. It's, for example, if you go to the store and you buy a pack of gum, before you can get the gum out of the store, you need to pay the tax on that pack of gum. That's essentially what a tariff is. A tariff is an additional tax on the good that's imported. So the person who pays is the person who is importing the goods, or in the case of the gum, you pay the tax as you are buying the pack of gum. Tariffs on things such as raw materials, such as wood or steel or aluminum, is just going to make it more expensive for people who are using those materials to manufacture within the United States. It's going to increase production costs. And then what does it do too, besides increasing production costs? It's also going to increase the cost that they have to sell to export those things. So that's why there are no winners at all when it comes to things as trade wars and tariffs. Yes, you can try to locally source, but locally sourcing, the cost may even be more expensive than if you bought it from overseas. And that becomes the problem there. If you don't have free and open trade, it just begins to hurt the economy and hurt the consumers. Another thing is anti-dumping. Anti-dumping is basically a preventative measure on countries that from selling their products, or they say they sell the products at below market values. Many, many years ago, I went through the anti-dumping in bedroom furniture for China. We were producing some bedroom furniture there. We ended up having to, totally, give up the business because the factories we were working with didn't have the protection from the anti-dumping. And the truth of the matter is that the factories of protection were really the big factories that were probably the ones that were more anti-dumping than us that were selling high-end bedroom furniture. The whole thing about the anti-dumping in the bedroom furniture was several U.S. company manufacturers went over and said, well, we can no longer compete with China, so that we basically need to have anti-dumping. They got the anti-dumping regulations, but I can tell you, no jobs really came back to the United States because of that. Instead, those companies switched the jobs to Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and other places. They did not bring those jobs back to America. That is, again, why I don't believe in anti-dumping. I realize sometimes maybe there's really unfair trade practices. The factories I've seen, which I personally saw with my own eyes, when I was working in China and we were dealing with this, was it hurt the small factories. It hurt the medium-sized factories. It hurt the factories that definitely were not anti-dumping, the factories that are doing higher-end product. Why? Because suddenly now, every piece of furniture they sold into the United States, they can no longer be competitive. So they had to switch from doing bedroom furniture to doing other types of furniture because of the anti-dumping. Another thing which can really affect trade, of course, is port congestion, delays, and shortages. Port congestion is often due to labor disputes, inefficient logistics, increased shipping demand. All of these things can make a difference of it. Things like the Panama Canal congestion can delay shipments, sending things from Asia to North America. So these are all types of port congestions. If there's a strike, which there's been many port strikes, that can, of course, cause a lot of problems too. Sometimes when there's been some port strikes, there's been the ships just sitting out there in the ocean, just kind of waiting to be able to land. And what happens with this is when things get delayed like this, it really becomes a problem for everything because suddenly, the shipping is made for you ship a container, you unload the container, and then the container gets reshipped. It's not made to be sitting out there in the ocean full of goods because then it begins to mess up everything and suddenly container costs become extremely high because nobody can get containers. It becomes a huge problem. So that goes to my next one, which is about shipping container shortages. They can increase freight costs. We saw this a lot during the COVID pandemic where suddenly like containers that would have cost $4,000 were costing, $18,000, $20,000, huge increase. And for a lot of the importers, they just don't have that built into their prices to be able to handle that. Other things which can, affect the whole, global supply chain is raw material shortages can cause production delays. If you have things like wood, metal, or, textiles, other things like that can cause a problem. Global lumber shortages can lead to delays or price hikes in wooden furniture. Or if you're looking for a specific type of furniture. Labor shortages can be huge too, especially if you're doing what we're doing, where you're dealing with the home furnishing and home decor. I was saying to somebody recently, like years ago when I was first working in China, a lot of the products that we did were hand painted, very intricately hand painted. We had, we work in factories that teams and teams and teams of these sort of qualified hand painters that could copy anything. And that's all they did was hand paint. And then suddenly the look changed and everybody wanted this transitional look and didn't want the hand painted anymore. All those hand painters have disappeared. Today in China, it's very hard to find somebody who can hand paint. Why? Because they've all disappeared. They have new jobs or they're doing new things and they're not working in the factories anymore. So, things as labor shortages or changes in looks or changes in designs can cause a labor shortage at some time. Political instability is another huge one that if there's political unrest or what's happening now in the United States, these government policies can disrupt manufacturing and can disrupt the import-export process and the global supply chain. Environmental disasters can too. Natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. Even things like the wildfires in California can affect it, disrupt logistics and delay shipments. Currency is also another big one that you need to always look out for because if suddenly the currency changes or in some way if you're buying in dollars and suddenly the dollar dips or changes, you can end up paying much more for the goods or for the order than you would have before. Changes in consumer demand. We talked about this a bit before when we talked about, the hand painting that, the consumer demand, the looks changed. So suddenly there became this whole, inventory imbalance. It became harder to find people to produce certain things. Environmental regulations. This in China has been huge, where I must say that China has been, cracking down a lot on environmental issues. I just read, today in the newspaper in Vietnam, where a factory was being forced to move because of environmental issues, in outside Vietnam. So all these environmental issues, pollution and things like that can cause a huge problem. And even the government may shut down the factory, force them to move or something else like that and tell them, we don't want you here anymore. Intellectual property disputes. If you have something, you bring something in and there's a property dispute with it, this can cause a problem or cause a delay. Transportation bottlenecks and delivery delays. This again is such as shortages of drivers. Even if you ship the container goes to the port or the warehouse or the storage facility in the United States. If there's no drivers to take the container out, that can also be a problem too. Or if suddenly fuel prices go up and the driver begins to say, well, look, I can't make money on this because fuel prices have got up so high that I can't move this container. And last could be cybersecurity, threats or attacks. As the global supply chain becomes more online, if there's a cybersecurity threat, if there's a data or operational, threat, this could become a risk for data and operation risk. So, that's why, cybersecurity is such an important thing. I have a nephew who's in cybersecurity, and recently Microsoft and LinkedIn, they did this type of survey, and they were looking at what companies were looking for. And the number one thing that most companies were looking for and didn't know if they could fulfill was cybersecurity. So that just shows you how important cybersecurity is today, that people are looking at cybersecurity, and that cybersecurity is a very essential and important part of all types of operating systems. There's many ways that you can navigate these challenges, that you can mitigate them in many different ways. And I've written a blog on this where you can go back and you can look at this if you're interested in it, called The Impact of Global Supply Chain Disruptions on Home Decor Availability. But as I said, we're not just talking about home decor, even though that is kind of like what we know about. This is really, we're talking about the overall impact of the global supply disruptions and what they could mean for you. I think with anything when it comes to risk, these are all things that we need to look at, all things that anybody who's in the global supply chain needs to look at and say, what can we do to mitigate these risks? I believe that that's important and essential. We hope that you will join with us, that you've enjoyed, and subscribe. We'd love to have you be part of our community. Thank you so much.